Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Today we are going to talk a little bit about Amsterdam. Most of you are already aware of my love of and perhaps pathological need to give historical context as far back as possible. Usually I try for early classical civilization, but I'll go as far back as the Neolithic if I can. Fortunately for all of you, though, I can't do that in the case of Amsterdam. If I were to try, I would have to brush up on my marine biology. Amsterdam was, until around the 10th century, underwater. They built dikes there in the Netherlands to keep the sea at bay, and within a couple of centuries the land was suitable for building and farming. Amsterdam was officially recognized as a city in 1306. Now, there were already people living there, but once it was recognized, it almost immediately became an important city in European trade. There were competitors in the Netherlands, but Amsterdam became a central hub for both ships and land-based caravans. Germany, Poland, Denmark, France, England, Sweden, they all had major shipping routes through Amsterdam. And that's not to mention the rest of the Netherlands or Belgium or Spain or eventually Russia. Essentially, all continental trade that was going out or coming in from the North Sea went through the Netherlands, and most of that went through Amsterdam. And that's basically all the historical context I plan on giving about Amsterdam. It was a young city, and it was a rich city, and it became a cultural hub as well. But for as big a part as the Dutch will play in our ongoing pirate drama, the medieval period of Dutch history is relatively quiet and short. They really became major players in what Philip Goss called that year of years in modern history, 1492, and that happened largely due to the Sephardic Jewish diaspora. This is episode 81. A funny thing happened on the way to Amsterdam. The more and more I read up on the Sephardic Jewish diaspora and mull it over in my mind, I begin to think that it may have been, in some ways, an even more important moment than Columbus making contact with the New World. Maybe not to the Aztec people or Inca people or other native people in the Americas, but it had wide-ranging ripples all throughout history. I mean, look at it this way. The Vikings visited the Muslim world in the Middle Ages, and they shared their shipbuilding techniques between them. Then those Arabian ships made their way to Iberia with the Emirate of Cordoba. That combination of Arab and Norse and Iberian shipbuilding techniques led to the caravel and the carrack, and finally to the galleon. All three of these ships were far better than anything that had come before. They were faster. They didn't require oar power, usually. They were better suited for long range and oceanic travel, and in the case of the galleon, they were better armed than any other ship in the Western world. These Iberian vessels allowed Spain and Portugal to build two of the largest empires that the world has ever known. Now, imagine that the year is 1945. The atomic bomb has been developed and finally, in Japan, put to use. It was the most powerful weapon the world had ever seen, and the world knew it. There was an arms race all throughout the early 20th century, especially during World War II, and now that arms race had been won. And then, did the President of the United States, Harry Truman, decide to kick Albert Einstein out of the country? Not only Einstein, but all of the other exiled European Jewish physicists that helped to develop the bomb? Of course he didn't. That would have been incredibly stupid. Not only did they help to win that war, did they put an end to the war in Japan, they had secrets that needed to be kept in America for as long as possible. You don't want to give that away to another country by exiling somebody out of stupid, foolish, xenophobic racism. So why did Ferdinand and Isabella, at the culmination of their arms race, this was an arms race that had gone on throughout the Middle Ages, and it ended up with Spain firmly out in front, why did they decide to kick out the Sephardi Jews? The answer is obvious. They felt on top of the world, and it was inspired by anti-Semitic racism. But it seems incredibly foolish to me. The Jewish people were well known for writing things down. They had a spectacular language, and they used it to record things better, or at least as well as, anyone else in Europe. Not to mention, many of those Sephardic Jews had a very personal, intimate working relationship with the shipyards and the merchant fleets of Spain and Portugal. Those exiles took that knowledge with them when they were forced to leave, and we've already seen how that worked out for the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan Suleiman welcomed in this educated middle-class elite with open arms. Orouge and his heir Barbarossa worked tirelessly to bring them in. And the Ottomans put all that knowledge that was now a part of their empire to use. They had printing presses and medicine, as well as new designs for ships. And then the combined Arab and Turkish and Berber and Jewish corsairs kicked the Catholics all around the Mediterranean. They won the Mediterranean for 30 years. The late Middle Ages, for the Jewish population of Spain, is considered a golden age. Science, medicine, sanitation, education was all significantly better than anywhere else in Europe. And then the Catholic monarchs kicked them out. And wouldn't you know it, when they all arrived in the Ottoman Empire, we saw the dawn of the Ottoman Golden Age. Not the Islamic Golden Age, that's a different thing entirely, but under Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire expanded further and became more prosperous and powerful than it ever had been before. Not all of that was exactly due to the Jewish diaspora and their influx into the Ottoman Empire, but their influence certainly helped, and it may not have been as strong as it was without them. That's due to a number of factors, but those shipbuilding techniques were certainly part of it. But the Ottoman Empire wasn't the only landing site for Sephardic Jewish exiles. First, most of them went to Portugal. Remember the conversos who were crypto-Jews hiding in Portugal? Well, that happened right when Portugal was using their brand new ship designs to start up the first global empire. And this might be a good moment to talk very briefly about the early Portuguese Empire. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about them in the days to come, but for now we need a basis for how the Portuguese Empire interacted with the Jewish world and the Muslim world. See, the Portuguese were an empire that expanded even before the Spanish did, or at least at first they were much more successful. Remember Henry the Navigator? He established dozens of African colonies in the latter half of the 1400s, and most of those colonies were in Morocco, on the Atlantic coast of North Africa. Now, as you might imagine, the Moroccans weren't terribly pleased about all of this, but Portugal promised lucrative trade and protection from the Ottoman Empire, and it did actually sort of work out that way. It was kind of like a mob shakedown, though. You know, a couple of Portuguese princes might come into your shop one day and say, "Hey, I hear these Ottomans have been giving you a little trouble. Not to worry, my friend, we'll take care of that little problem for you. All you gotta do is let us set up shop around here, and every once in a while we'll come behind the counter, open up the register, and strip literally all of the mineral wealth and gold and silver out of your country. And if you give us any hassle, we might have to smack yous around a little bit, rough up the place, maybe assassinate a caliph or two. And when the Spanish needed a place to make landfall, usually to make war on the Ottomans, which was fine with the Moroccans, it was Morocco that had to oblige." Now, the Moroccan Sultanate, what's called the Wattasid dynasty, were Berbers, North African natives that were descended from ancient Berber kings. They had seized power when the last Arabian dynasty declined there in Morocco. Now, the Wattasids were firmly in the pro-Portuguese, pro-Spanish, anti-getting swallowed by the Ottoman Empire camp. However, there were a large number of Arab, rather than Berber, Muslim nobles in Morocco. They were the remnants of the Caliphate of Cordoba that had fled to Morocco during the Reconquista. Most of those Arab princes moved to Morocco after 1492. And suffice it to say, those exiles from Spain hated the Catholics that had kicked them out of their homes. They comprised the anti-Portuguese, anti-Spanish, we're cool with the Ottomans camp. They were ethnically and culturally distinct from the rest of Morocco, and they're going to play a major role in the piracy to come. But when they left the Cordoban Caliphate, they originally settled in the southern parts of Morocco, and they established a base of power there. Now, they called themselves the Saidi dynasty, but they officially recognized the Wattasid Sultan as their king and the king of Morocco. Then, when the Pope signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, he told the Portuguese that they could have Brazil and Africa and Asia. So, Portuguese ships set sail. Bartolomeu Diaz and Vasco da Gama colonized eastern Africa and much of Asia. When we get to the Pirates of the Round and the Red Sea Men, we'll have to cover all of that in a lot more depth. But the point is, the Portuguese used their amazing ships that were influenced by many of the Jewish designs from Jewish shipbuilders that had come to Portugal to create an empire. Now again, this wasn't all due to the Jewish influence on shipbuilding, but that probably helped the empire grow. But then Spain began to crack down on the Portuguese conversos, so those Jews in Portugal fled elsewhere. Now, we've already talked a bit about the Jews that went to America. Lima and Jamaica and Veracruz and Panama, they all benefited from the Jewish mercantile and medical and educational influence. And we're going to return to them later, especially Jamaica and then on to Brazil. But for now, the New World's really far away from our story, and most of the Jews that made it out to the Americas already had connections and some funds to help establish themselves in the New World. But the Jewish people that didn't have as much looked closer to home. Going to America was expensive, and even going to the Ottoman Empire took some amount of independence. But going to other places in Europe, well, a couple of decades earlier, that wouldn't have been, well, it would have been troublesome, to say the least. In 1492, Europe was still uniformly Catholic and deeply anti-Semitic. Where could a group of exiles go if they were Jewish? There was Italy or France or Austria, most of Europe, in fact, that would have persecuted them, even worse than the Spanish had in some cases. But then only a few years later, these Portuguese conversos received some help from an unexpected and deeply anti-Semitic source, an Augustinian friar named Martin Luther. Now, Luther's feelings toward the Jewish people are well documented, and he certainly didn't have any intention of helping them. But when he sparked the Reformation in protest against the monolithic Catholic Church, well, Protestants and Jews found out that they had one major thing in common. So some Jews were able to find happy homes in many of the Protestant-leaning regions of Europe. There were some German states that would take them in. Some went to Denmark. When the Huguenots started making waves in France, some Jews found homes there as well. Now, not all Protestants were friendly with the Jewish people, some of them very, very far from it. But with the printing press and translations of the Bible into languages that they could actually read, many Protestants began to learn that the Jews were not, in fact, a cabal of demonic devil worshippers. I mean, many of them learned for the very first time that Jesus was himself Jewish. But there was one harbor in Europe that was particularly welcoming toward the Sephardic Jews, and that was Amsterdam. Now, whether or not the Netherlands would have been so welcoming under normal circumstances, even with all of their Calvinists and Lutherans mucking around, is up for debate. They had a history, in some cases, of not being so welcoming to the Jewish people. But at the moment, they had bigger problems than a few Jewish refugees. The Netherlands had an Anabaptist problem. The Netherlands was something of a breeding ground for Anabaptist sects, in particular, radical apocalyptic cults. One minister named Melchior Hoffman was preaching that Jesus was going to return in the city of Strasbourg in 1533. He was going to purge the wicked and carry the faithful to heaven. Jesus, not Hoffman. Now, that didn't happen, but two of his followers, Jan Matthias and Jan van Leyden, told everyone, wait, no, it's not happening in Strasbourg, and it's not in 1533. but Jesus was coming back to the city of Munster in 1534. Now, I assume most of you have heard this story already if you are the type of person that enjoys to listen to history podcasts. And it's a good story. If you haven't heard it, go find Dan Carlin's episode on it and listen immediately. Well, after you're done with this episode. But for anyone not familiar with the story, these Anabaptists took over Munster. They kicked out all of the Catholics and then kicked out all of the moderate Lutherans. They instituted some archaic Old Testament religiosity, and they renamed Munster the New Jerusalem. And I'd like you to remember that name, New Jerusalem, for later. The forces of Catholicism there in Germany besieged Munster for months, and the whole ordeal ended in what was basically an apocalyptic battle for this particular sect of Anabaptists. Only there wasn't the whole salvation and returning to heaven thing. There was torture and execution. Now, Munster was a German city under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, and at the time, Charles V was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was also, though, the Lord of the Netherlands, and he made sure that the Dutch Anabaptists, who had in some ways influenced and created this trouble in Munster, were going to pay for the crimes of those Anabaptists. They executed every Anabaptist they could get their hands on in the Netherlands. It was a fairly major undertaking, actually. So when those Spanish Sephardic Jews left Charles's Spain and slipped into Charles's Amsterdam, the king and the Inquisition were a bit busy dealing with bigger problems. They were dealing with those Anabaptist heretics. The Jews were mostly allowed to just go on their way, so long as they left Spain and Portugal. Now, the next few decades saw more and more Jews and those crypto-Jews travel from Spain and Portugal to the Ottoman Empire, to Jamaica, and to Amsterdam. Now, remember that throughout all of this, the Barbary corsairs were still doing their thing in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa and the heirs of Barbarossa were continuing their reigns of terror all along the Spanish and Italian coasts. The Ottoman Empire and Europe were still fighting for control of the Mediterranean. But our story of Amsterdam really picks up in 1566. Charles V was no longer in power by this time, nor was his brother. It was actually his nephew, Maximilian II, that was the Holy Roman Emperor. Philip II was the King of Spain. He was the son of Charles V. And Elizabeth I, who was Charles V's aunt's ex-husband's daughter and his son's sister-in-law and prospective wife-to-be, well, Elizabeth was Queen of England. 1566, though, was the year in which a number of Dutch Calvinists went around burning down Catholic churches. They destroyed what they saw as iconoclastic effigies, and they killed a number of priests and many, many Catholic parishioners. That's what's called the Beeldenstroom. In 1568, 2 years later, the States General of the 7 United Dutch Provinces and the most powerful nobleman in the Netherlands, a man named William of Orange, or William of Nassau, or William the Silent, began the Dutch revolt to oust their hated overlord, the Duke of Alba. Now, we talked about all of this long, long ago. There's no reason to rehash the Dutch revolt and the sea beggars here. If you're not familiar, you can go back and listen to some of our earliest episodes. If you'd just like a refresher, maybe this is a good time. The point, though, is this Beeldenstroom and this Dutch revolt actually made things a bit hard for the Spanish Jews living in the Netherlands. There is this sentiment that was very prevalent in medieval Europe, and the Nazis even brought it back in much of their anti-Jewish propaganda. It suggests that the Jewish people are a people without a nation, or at least a people that do not belong to any nation aside from Israel. And that sentiment made them outsiders, even in what were their own birthplaces, their national homes. This idea suggests that Jews are always foreigners, no matter where they were born. They were people of Judea, wherever they might actually reside. Now, that's all nonsense. I know American Jews that are more American than most Americans in all the traditional senses. Football and burgers and beer. Red-blooded Americans, right? And then the German Jews were largely patriotic Germans. Many of them fought proudly for Germany in World War I. And those Spanish Sephardic Jews that were kicked out of Spain, well, they were Spanish. Some of them spoke Hebrew, yeah, but all of them spoke Spanish, and when they spoke Dutch, they did so with a Spanish accent. Now, some of them were named in the Hebrew tradition, mostly the rabbis, but most of them had names like Diego or Luis or Francisco or Pedro or Maria. So, when the Dutch were engaging in the Beeldenstroom and killing and being killed by Spaniards during their revolt, that could cause trouble when a group of Sephardic Jewish immigrants with Spanish names went around speaking in Spanish or Spanish accents. Most of these new immigrants didn't yet speak Dutch, so they faced sometimes persecution, but usually that was too strong of a word. Hostility, though, definitely works in this situation. Not for being Jewish, though. That would usually have been the case, but here it was for being Spanish. Edward Kritzler tells us about two men. They were named Joseph Diaz Soyero and Antonio Enrique. Those are pretty perfect Iberian names. They were Jewish, though, and they were visiting a secret Jewish synagogue there in Amsterdam that was meeting late one evening. There were a number of local Jews gathered within, when all of a sudden the doors were kicked in by local officials. Now, the Sephardic Jews that were refugees to Amsterdam, well, they were used to this sort of behavior, relatively speaking. In their experience, coming from Spain and Portugal, it was the Inquisition that usually did this sort of thing. And these worshippers naturally thought that this was the Inquisition as well. You might say that they had been trained to expect the Spanish Inquisition. Never mind. So, the people that were there, they ran. The ones that didn't get away, and that's most of them, they were nearly all arrested, but not for practicing Judaism. They were arrested for being a group of Spaniards in a secret meeting speaking Spanish during the Dutch revolt. But here's the kicker. They didn't speak Dutch, and their captors didn't speak Spanish, despite this being the formerly Spanish Netherlands. So these Jews didn't understand that they were being arrested for their Spanish rather than Jewish heritage. But before I complete the story of Joseph Diaz and Antonio Enrique and all of the Jews that were so recently arrested, we need to take a step back and look at two things. First, in the year 1580, the crowns of Spain and Portugal combined in what they call the Iberian Union. King Philip II of Spain became King Philip I of Portugal. He would further confuse that issue by naming his son Philip, the third and second, and having a grandson also named Philip, the fourth and third. And you know how Charles V was kinda cool about the Jews? Like, yes, I am the Grand High Inquisitor, and you Jews are all heretics, but you can go to Portugal or Jamaica or Amsterdam, and even though I am technically the lord of all of those places, I'll just sort of look the other way so long as you're not in Spain. Now, he wasn't going to be winning any prizes for inclusiveness, and the Jews, in many cases, suffered terribly under his rule, but it could have been a lot worse. Well, when his son was in charge, Philip II, it was a lot worse. When he took over the crown of Portugal in 1580, priority number one was to deal with all of these conversos. Now, he knew full well most of the Portuguese conversos were crypto-Jews. Everyone did. It was an open secret. They were practicing their religion in secret, so he decided to deal with that problem. And, that wasn't really priority number one. Priority number one was incorporating the Portuguese Empire into Spain's empire, which would create the largest empire the world had ever known, an empire on which the sun literally never set that generated more wealth than had ever been seen in world history. But then, priority number two, the Jews. Philip II, and first, decided to deal with them in... Well, it was a centuries-old practice that he decided to use, called the auto de fe. That's, in English, an act of faith. Edward Kritzler, once again, describes these better than I ever could. He writes, quote, "The date was January 16, 1606. Freezing winds blowing off the Atlantic did nothing to deter the citizens of Lisbon from crowding the roadside to jeer the prisoners on their way to the plaza to be tried at the auto da fe. The victims, barefoot and naked to the waist, were whipped along the icy cobblestone streets by white-hooded guards of the Holy Brotherhood. On horseback, heading the procession, were the familiars of the Holy Office wearing black tunics silhouetted with a white cross. Behind them, the 155 half-naked penitents stumbled along, 6 abreast, their backs lashed raw by the guards' studded whips. The Judaizers carried unlit candles to signify that the light of the true faith had not yet illuminated their souls." This is one of those things that, living in the age of terrorism, I can imagine, in the modern world even, a group of bearded, unwashed religious radicals, not entirely unlike pirates, showing up on some faraway shore and killing and robbing and kidnapping. I can mentally put myself in the world where that sort of thing happens. I mean, pirates are doing that off the coast of Africa today. In Syria and Yemen and Libya, those things are all happening. So when I read about Henry Morgan or Blackbeard, I get that. I can contextualize it, but this auto da fe, this act of faith, I can't imagine anything like that in today's world. And things like that are still happening. There are religious atrocities and ethnic cleansings that are not unheard of. But Spain, and I realize this might paint me as a Western elitist, but in 1600 Spain was the world power, and Lisbon was a major city in that empire. Can you imagine something like the atrocities that are taking place in the more remote parts of Asia today, happening in San Francisco or Rio de Janeiro or Shanghai or Amsterdam or, Lisbon? It seems like this just unimaginable atrocity. But here's the thing. To the people of Lisbon, this was seen as a mercy. It was public shaming and physical torture, but it was in the service of repentance and the majesty of God's love. These inquisitors and the authorities and the jeering masses, they believed that they were doing these Jews a service. They were helping them to get into heaven. Edward Kritzler continues, quote, "Prisoners not admitting their guilt were tortured until they did. Those who remained unrepentant were liable to be burned. Age made no difference. 10-year-old sisters were tortured, and a 96-year-old woman burned at the stake." And he continues, "Having seen the light, they could light their candles and donate a fifth of their possessions to the church." End quote. And donate is very heavily in quotes. Now, 2 of the prisoners that were present there in Lisbon at this auto da fe in 1606 were none other than Joseph Diaz and Antonio Enrique. They were part of that procession. They were whipped, they were tortured, but they were fortunate enough to be set free. And this was actually pretty lucky. The inquisitor who was in charge of that particular auto da fe in Lisbon, he was well known for disbelieving the conversions professed by his Jewish prisoners. He was known for torturing them until he finally believed in their conversion, at which point he did them the service of sending them straight up to heaven. Now, history catches up with Antonio and Joseph a few years later in that secret synagogue in Amsterdam. But before we conclude their story, we need to talk about that second element in that Dutch raid. And we actually get a bit of piracy here, believe it or not. The reason that we are fortunate enough to know anything about Joseph and Antonio is because of one man. He was a Jewish Moroccan merchant, a diplomat, and a pirate named Samuel Palache. Now, we're not going to get a lot of piracy here, more intrigue and espionage, but it was done by a pirate. We know a fair bit about Samuel Palache, thanks to the records, the glorious records kept by those Sephardic Jews. His family was Iberian. They came from Spain, but during the Reconquista they were pushed further and further south until they resided in Cordoba, with the last of the Muslims in Spain to have a foothold there. Now Samuel's father was a rabbi in Cordoba, but after the Reconquista was completed, at some point after 1492, Samuel's father brought his wife to Morocco. Now, Arouge and his heir Barbarossa and Sinan Rais were all supposed to bring any Jews that they got from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, and Morocco wasn't a part of the Ottoman Empire. It was an independent caliphate, so it's unlikely that the Palache family came over with those Barbary pirates, but it's not impossible, especially with Sinan Rais. He would have probably been sympathetic to their plight, and they knew people in Morocco already. Now Samuel was born there in Morocco in the city of Fez in a Jewish ghetto. His father took up rabbinical duties in the city, and Samuel was given a good Jewish religious and secular education. As he grew older, he took up a seaborne trade, though. Edward Kritzler tells us that though the gates of his Jewish ghetto were closed every night, Samuel and his brother Joseph were allowed to pass those gates freely. And they were given this boon for a very specific reason. It was known in the community that their nighttime activities were extracurricular to their regular merchant duties. They were the sort of activities that would enrich the entire city at the expense of Spain. It was smuggling and piracy and fencing stolen goods. And I should mention here that most of the piratical details we have on Samuel Palache come from two sources. There's Edward Kritzler, and then there's a Spanish writer named Mercedes Garcia Arenal. Now, they interpret much of Palache's life as one of piracy, and even though that's somewhat controversial, I'm going to follow their lead here. Now, most of the piracy occurring in the Western Mediterranean was due to the Barbarossas and their fleet. It was coming from the Barbary states, but Palache was a central figure in the piracy coming out of Morocco. He was really the only major player there at the time, and he used the Strait of Gibraltar as his hunting ground. Now, the guards allowed him to pass through. Well, even though Morocco was allied to Spain technically, they had a strange sort of relationship. They were allies, but they were allies kind of like the U.S. and Pakistan are allies. They were at peace, but they hated each other. They'd sign treaties of alliance, not because they were friends, but because they needed each other. Spain needed a friendly place to land in North Africa, and Morocco needed Spain to protect them from the Ottoman Empire. And both of them wanted friendly relations there in the Strait of Gibraltar. Without it, it would create unbelievable problems. If they broke out into open fighting, the strait would be closed, and access between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean shut down. So, the Moroccan guards there at the Jewish ghetto in Fez, they winked and they nodded, and they let Samuel Palache through to go steal Spanish goods along the coast and bring them home to be bought up by locals at a very fair price. Now, Kritzler also tells us that one of Samuel's favorite tactics was to steal Spanish goods, either on the coast or out at sea, and then repackage them in his own merchant packaging and sell them back to the Spanish at a markup. Now, most of the Spanish probably knew that this was happening, and it was a bit petty maybe, but it was profitable, and it was the sort of revenge that a religious minority within the country of an inferior member of an alliance could get away with. But then, Samuel and Joseph Palache were contacted by the Moroccan Sultan. And here's where this story intersects with that story of the Barbarossas. See, Barbarossa's son, Hassan Pasha, was the Pasha of Algiers, and he was looking for something big and bold that would impress the Sultan, and he decided that would be interfering in Morocco. That anti-Portuguese set in Morocco from Cordoba, the Saadi dynasty, well, they had ousted a number of Portuguese settlements from their southernmost holdings in Morocco, and Hassan Pasha was impressed by that. He liked their moxie, so he agreed to help the Saadi dynasty in their war on Portugal and with the Wattasid dynasty in Morocco if they promised to be allies with him in Algiers. Then he took the city of Tlemcen and handed that to the Saadi. Now, do you remember there was an old Looney Tunes cartoon in which there was a tiny, scrappy little mouse that picked a fight with the local tomcat outside? The mouse was all, put 'em up, and the cat's like, what is this guy doing? Then the cat just picks up the mouse and pops him in his mouth. But then the bulldog shows up from around the corner, and it turns out he's actually friends with that little mouse. So the cat opens his mouth, pulls the mouse out, sets him down nicely, and pats him on the head. That's kind of how I see this interaction with Tlemcen and the Saadi and the Wattasids. Now, Tlemcen was in Morocco at the time. Today, it's part of Algiers. You can see where this is headed, but not for a minute yet. Now, Hassan Pasha didn't ask permission to take Tlemcen, to get involved in Moroccan politics. His father never asked permission either, or rarely did, but he had the military strength and the popularity to back up his territorial claims. He also had the political pull back in Istanbul to get away with his more audacious moves. Hassan Pasha had a famous father, but he didn't have any of that other stuff. He wasn't popular, he wasn't famous, and he wasn't powerful, and he had no political pull. So that was the moment when Hassan was pushed out as the Pasha of Algiers, and Dragut, who did have all of those things, assumed control of Algiers. Now, Tlemcen was a liability for the Ottoman Empire, for the Sultan in particular. It potentially would open up a whole new theater of war that Suleiman was not yet prepared to fight in. There was fighting all over the Ottoman Empire, on many of her frontiers, and Suleiman didn't want to open up a new front. So he smoothed it over with the Moroccan Sultan, a man named Zidane. Dragut sent an embassy, or rather, Hassan Aga, that eunuch who was in actual control of Algiers, to tell Zidane that they were not going to be interfering in his political world. They were not going to be offering any support to the Saadi dynasty. And Zidane was able to send an army to take back Tlemcen. The Wattasid tomcat popped that Saadi mouse into its mouth. But Zidane realized here what a tight spot he was in. He had Algiers and the Ottoman Empire interfering on one side of his kingdom, even if the Sultan promised that they wouldn't do so again. On the other side of his kingdom, he had Spain and pirates like Samuel Palache clashing and causing ripples. Now, Spain knew full well that the Sultan, Zidane, could have stopped those pirates out of Morocco any time that he chose to do so. But rather than demand that he do that, the Spanish just politely looked the other way while the Sultan openly worked with the pirates. Now, the Spanish captured and killed any of those Moroccan pirates when and where they were able to, and the Sultan just politely looked the other way. That's just how business was done. And it was that way because when Samuel Palache was at the height of his raiding, Spain was at war with England. This was the latter half of the 16th century. Francis Drake, the Spanish Armada, the shipyards at Cadiz being burned, tons of Spanish silver being buried all across the isthmus at Panama. That little war. So Spain was too busy to spend many resources hunting a few Jewish pirates in the Mediterranean. But when that war was over, Zidane needed to reestablish relations with his old friends, the Spanish, who he had always been close with and never aided pirates in capturing their ships just because he could. So Sultan Zidane needed somebody to undertake a mission to Spain, and that's when he contacted the pirate and merchant Samuel Palache. Now his job was going to be to carry a cargo of gems and spices to trade them for beeswax that was necessary to make candles. They didn't have much of that in Morocco. But that's not all his job was. He wanted Samuel Palache to be a double agent. Palache was to undertake his trading mission. That was normal, but then he was supposed to tell the Spanish authorities that he really wanted to defect. He had tons of state secrets about Zidane's court. Everybody knew that he had been there before. So he was to feed the Spanish false information and to spy on the Spanish for Zidane. Now this is the sort of story that would just make a fantastic movie. And I think it might already exist in Spain. I wouldn't be surprised if it did. But for 4 years after that initial mission, Samuel Palache played a dangerous game with the Duke of Medina Sidonia, the Spanish ambassador, and King Philip II himself. He got involved in court politics in Madrid, he lined the right pockets, and he even played powerful Spanish nobles off one another. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was his first patron there in Spain. He was a viceroy in Morocco, so he was the first powerful Spanish contact he made. So for most of the first few years, the Duke would defend Samuel Palache to the king and all of the nobles at court. Now, of course, the Duke was getting rich off the piracies of Samuel Palache at the expense of his own countrymen. His patronage finally ran out, though, in the year 1605. Things were getting a bit hot. Some people were noticing that he was getting rich off some piracies. But King Philip asked the Duke if Palache could be trusted to, quote, find things out about Barbary. The Duke replied to him, though, his business is all trickery. But at that point, Samuel Palache no longer needed the patronage of the Duke of Medina Sidonia. See, he'd spun a good tale into the ear of King Philip II, and just a few weeks after asking the Duke that question, the king granted Samuel Palache a license to settle down in Madrid. He decided that even though the Duke didn't trust him, I can trust him to find things out about Barbary. So Palache began preparations to find a nice little house in Madrid and settle down. But before he could, the Inquisition caught wind of him. This was actually the Duke's doing here. He had confessed everything, all of his crimes, to the Inquisition, telling them the entire time that he knew this man, who was now a confidant of the king, was a Jew and a spy, and he meant nothing but evil for Spain. Before he could actually move in there in Madrid, Samuel Palache ran for it. And he was in Madrid at the time. He didn't have a home in Spain, but he was living there. So we're talking about a series of narrow escapes with soldiers of the Spanish Inquisition. We're talking about daring chases through the streets and alleys of Madrid. There were a couple of swashbuckling scrapes with some of those authorities. It's all very Three Musketeers and Alexander Dumas and Errol Flynn. But Samuel Palache landed at the home of the French ambassador in Madrid. Now, the homes of ambassadors at the time worked very much like a modern-day embassy. The crown had virtually no authority there, which was good for the French ambassador and for Palache. Now, when all of this was going on, the King of France was Henry IV. He was a member of the Bourbon dynasty and himself a Calvinist Protestant. So Palache felt relatively safe in the home of an official rival of Spain and a man who was a fellow religious minority member. Now, the ambassador's home there in Madrid overlooked the town square, and Palache couldn't leave, so he had to spend every Friday looking out those windows at the town square at the Auto da Fe of Madrid. Every Friday he had to watch Sephardic Jews get beaten and tortured and interrogated and marched through town and publicly shamed. Every Friday he did this for 6 whole months. Now, we don't have a record of Samuel Palache's departure from the ambassador's home or of his escape from Spain, but we can surmise from some of the hard-bitten historical data that surrounds the event that at one point Palache would pull out his sword, grab a rope, slash the knot that was tying it down, and ride that rope to the rafters while a chandelier on the other end fell on the heads of his bumbling opponents. Then he shouted, "Adios, muchachos," and slashed an S in the tapestry and then rode off into the night. But when history actually catches up with Palache, we find him in Amsterdam. At some point after leaving the ambassador's home, he made his way to the Netherlands. And we catch up with him at a meeting with the Prince of Orange, with Maurice of Nassau. That was William the Silent's son. Now, we're going to look at that meeting later, but Samuel Palache didn't just waltz into the office of the stadtholder as some unknown agent. See, Palache wasn't just a pirate and a smuggler or a spy. He was the son of a rabbi. He was in his own right a successful merchant, and by this point he was even a well-known diplomat. And during his years of intrigue between Medina Sidonia and Philip II, Samuel had made more than a few side trips to the Netherlands. He'd been chased off, actually, a few times by local pastors and other diplomats in the Netherlands, but he found a community there, in Amsterdam, of fellow Jews, Sephardic Jews. His uncle actually might already have been living there in Amsterdam, so he may have had a good reason to go visit him. But in addition to all of the spying in Spain, he acted as something of a Harriet Tubman or a Moses or maybe a Baba or Rouge to many of the crypto-Jews that were hiding in Portugal and Spain, that were facing the auto da fe. He may have gotten word to many of those people he saw beaten and tortured in the streets of Madrid, telling them that he had a way to get them to Amsterdam, where there was a community that would accept them. He was a guiding light for many of the Portuguese conversos that had tried to stay in Iberia and make a life but realized it would no longer be possible. Now, it started off with the family of Samuel Palache, but then his friends, and then their families, and then their friends, and then their families. Now, this wasn't entirely Palache's doing, but he was kind of at the forefront of this exodus toward Amsterdam. In just a few years' time, Amsterdam would house tens of thousands of Sephardi exiles, and it was Palache that was the trimmer that sparked that tidal wave. Samuel Palache found himself in Amsterdam well before his meeting with the stadholder on that very evening that Joseph Diaz and Antonio Enrique were arrested in that raid on the secret synagogue. In fact, he probably set up that meeting. He knew the trustworthy Jews in Amsterdam. He knew most of the locals. These were the sort of backroom meetings that Palache was familiar with, not just as a pirate and not just as a smuggler and a spy, but as a crypto-Jew working in Spain. Joseph and Antonio were both fresh off the boat. They had just recently arrived from Lisbon, and they were aided in getting to Amsterdam by Samuel Palache, and he showed them places where they could find friends and aid. The service would look strange to any modern Jews or anybody familiar with the practices of modern-day Judaism. See, Samuel Palache's uncle was a rabbi. He knew the ins and outs of Jewish religious practices probably better than anyone else in Amsterdam. But even that, he had been living as an Iberian for many years and then an exile in Morocco. He likely didn't have a copy of the Torah until he moved to Amsterdam. He likely didn't have any experience with real religious services. He'd spent his entire life attending Catholic or perhaps Muslim services. He knew that he was Jewish and his family was Jewish, but at this point, most of these Jewish exiles in Amsterdam didn't really know what that meant. They had tales, oral histories passed down to them, but they didn't have any written record of their religious past or their religious teachings. So they were figuring out a lot of this for the first time. Now, everyone there at that secret religious ceremony was new to Amsterdam, and none of them spoke much Dutch. Samuel Palache's uncle, if he was there, spoke the best, but I don't think he was, so it was probably Samuel himself that spoke the best Dutch, but even that was rudimentary. He knew Berber from Morocco, he knew Hebrew, and he knew Spanish, and I think a little Greek and Arabic, but he only knew the most basic of Dutch. Now, remember that this secret synagogue was not being raided for being Jewish, but they were arrested for being a group of obvious Spaniards meeting in secret during the Dutch revolt against Spain. But none of them knew that. They didn't speak any Dutch, so when the authorities kicked down the door and arrested them, they just assumed it was for practicing Judaism. Now, Palache attempted to gauge the situation here, but when a bunch of cops bust down your door and start screaming at you in Dutch while you're being put in chains, that's not exactly the best moment to overcome a language barrier. He did his best to explain the situation in Spanish, and though these were the formerly Spanish Netherlands, the guards didn't speak any Spanish. He tried Greek and he tried Hebrew, but he didn't have any better luck. But then the local rabbi, Palache's uncle, showed up while everyone was being hauled off to what we can only assume was a dark, dank dungeon somewhere. Now, he spoke the best Dutch, but he spoke spectacular Latin, and so did the Dutch officials. So he was actually able to speak to the guards in Dutch and convince them to lead the prisoners to a magistrate rather than a dungeon, and before the magistrate, in Latin, he was able to explain the situation. Look, I know they all have Spanish names, and they all speak with Spanish accents, but they aren't agents of Spain, I promise you. Well, except my nephew, but he's a super secret double agent, so that's fine. They hate Spain as much as you guys do. You hate being subject to Spanish whims? Well, they were Jews in hiding during the Inquisition, man. They will help you against the Spanish. I know you guys have been taking in Jewish families for decades now, and now you have a mass of wealthy, educated Jews that know the ins and outs of Spain intimately. Oh, and this guy here, Fernando, well, he knows how to build amazing ships just like those that are busy conquering the New World in Asia. Ever had any interest in taking over Portugal's many lucrative colonies there in Asia, Mr. Dutchman? Well, with those ships, you can do just that. Well, okay, maybe Samuel Palache's uncle didn't say all that, but he communicated the three important things that needed to be known here in Latin. Spain, bad. Jews, friends. Amsterdam, great. And that was all that the burgermeisters and stadholders of Amsterdam needed to hear. After this little event, the pastors and the town fathers of Amsterdam got together and declared that the Jews in the city could practice Judaism openly. They were even allowed to build a synagogue. They were allowed to bring people in from Israel who knew the ins and outs of their religion. And they did so. Samuel Palache's father and his uncle became the first two rabbis of the synagogue of Amsterdam. And with that, the Portuguese Jews from all across Europe and even the Ottoman Empire began to come to Amsterdam in droves. In the end, it came to more than 50,000 Jewish men, women, and children in the city. And you know how there was this golden age in Spain when all of the Jews were still allowed to work and live and, not be burned at the stake? And then there was that Ottoman golden age when Suleiman invited in all of the Sephardi Jews he could find. Well, the next few decades of Dutch history are called the Dutch Golden Age. They had medicine and mercantilism from the Jews. They had new shipbuilding techniques that allowed them to build fleets of flutes based on Spanish designs brought over by, you guessed it, Sephardi Jews. They established colonies in the New World and took over colonies from other powers, mostly from Spain and Portugal. And this wasn't all the Jews. There were many other economic and political factors feeding into this golden age, not to mention their revolution and self-determination. But the Jews were there in large numbers now, and they helped. And then, to top all of this off with a dash of piracy, the Jewish merchant families in Amsterdam began to establish connections with the Jewish families on Jamaica, and between them, they began to build what would become a worldwide network of fencing, of illicit trade goods that would be stolen from Spain by the buccaneers and pirates of Port Royal and Tortuga and Nassau, and they would be sold to the Dutch merchants on their flutes and brought back to be fenced by the Jews of Amsterdam. But that's all looking way into the future. But all of that was sparked by this one Jewish Moroccan pirate named Samuel Palache. Next time, we're going to look at that meeting between Maurice of Nassau and Samuel Palache. That meeting established diplomatic relations between the United Dutch Provinces and Morocco, and those diplomatic relations led to a connection between Amsterdam and the Barbary states of Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, which would lead us, directly through the actions of Samuel Palache, to the first great age of piracy, of real piracy, in the Mediterranean since the days of Rome. And it will also lead us, through a very twisting road, to the construction of Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge. People will sometimes ask me who my favorite pirate is, or maybe who the greatest pirate ever is, and I never find myself able to answer that question. It's probably because I've read too much and thought too much about pirates, but there are contenders. Henry Avery is a contender. It's part of the reason I chose his flag for the podcast logo. He was successful as a pirate and probably got away with it. I like that. But then again, he was a slave owner and was very active in the slave trade and some of the more illicit elements of it. So, yeah, that's pretty uncool. Benjamin Hornigold is another. He was a privateer with a code, a personal code of ethics, not just a pirate code, and I like that a lot. But he would eventually turn coat and hunt down some of his former fellows. I like that a lot less. Usually, when I'm thinking about this topic, it comes down to the two pirates that were Hornigold's star pupils, Edward Teach and Samuel Bellamy. Both of them have gripping, fascinating stories filled with moral quandaries and ethical dilemmas. But they have problems as well. Bellamy is a serious contender for greatest pirate ever, and probably the most successful. And he's a character full of contradictions and questions that are raised, but he lacks the flair of someone like a Blackbeard or a Bartholomew Roberts. But that raises the other problem, the problem of where reality ends and fantasy begins. How much of what we know about Blackbeard is rooted in actual truth, and how much of it is myth? Do we like the myth more than we do the reality? And is that even really a problem? Maybe it's fine. The truth behind King Arthur or Robin Hood, if there is any truth, well, that wouldn't be nearly as engaging as the myth, and it wouldn't teach all of the same lessons. But when I'm asked that question, I wonder what makes a pirate the greatest pirate ever, or even just the greatest pirate of their age. Is it measured in getting away with the piracy? Is it measured in how much the pirate in question managed to steal? Or is it in the myth that surrounds them and how they are remembered? Now, I want you to keep that question in mind over the next few weeks. I'm not prepared to answer it by a long shot, but it's an important question to think on. Because for the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about a cast of characters that are nearly all contenders. Not necessarily for greatest pirate ever, but definitely for greatest pirate of their age. There were maybe half a dozen pirate captains that were all working in the same region at roughly the same time. They almost all knew each other, and were probably friendly. Some of them were friends, but some of them were rivals, and some of them ended up as outright enemies. Now, we've talked before about the comparisons that could be made between eras of piracy in both the Mediterranean and the West Indies. I've talked before about Barbarossa as a pioneer, Francis Drake sort of character, and the privateers that followed Barbarossa were, in some ways, similar to the buccaneers. But when the buccaneer era was finally drawing to a close, and the governments in the Netherlands and England and even France started to tighten the leash, well, the privateering work started to dry up. There were some lean years for the buccaneers. But then, a few ship captains decided to leave the privateering world behind and turn pirate. They stole ships and armed them. They took those ships to sea where they captured cargo and better ships and better guns. Then most of them founded bases with shipwrights and merchant fences and defensible harbors, places that they could call home. That's Hornigold, that's Jennings and Vane and Teach and Bellamy and Rackham, that whole drama right there. But in the first years of the 17th century, the 1600s, we see a story not entirely unlike that of Nassau unfold. There was an explosion of ravenous pirates sailing out of what were virtually lawless ports and decimating shipping for years. Sometimes they brought international trade through, certain regions to a complete halt. They were pirates. They were real pirates, in a sense that Barbarossa and Dragut and the earlier Barbary corsairs really weren't. These were mariners without affiliation or allegiance. They were loyal only to themselves and their comrades. They were outlaws of the highest order. Hostis humanus generis, enemies of the whole human race. And it was actually here that old-fashioned legal code was pulled out and dusted off to deal with these pirates. And there were some philosophical similarities between the two groups as well. Now, in the early 17th century, they weren't really fleshed out yet, but we can see the roots of the almost egalitarian and almost anarchic and almost capitalist and almost socialist ideals that would go on to define many later pirates. There were some very significant philosophical differences as well, mostly religious, but not only in that. And as we tell their story, we're going to look at all of those similarities and all of those differences. But I think, or I hope to show at least, that we can find the roots of West Indian Golden Age piracy here in the Mediterranean in the first decade of the 1600s. This is episode 84, The Thieves' Path. These pirates in question have largely been overlooked, at least here in America and in our popular culture. Blackbeard and Captain Kidd and Henry Morgan are the pirates that we mythologize and that we mold so many of our villains and our anti-heroes after. But these Mediterranean pirates, well, I think they're better remembered in Europe. They were major characters in English and Italian plays, and there were books that were called true and accurate accounts, but mostly they were fiction. There was one play based on one of these characters, the character that's going to concern us today, that actually outsold King Lear in the London bookshops, and it had significantly longer runs at the theater than Lear. I guess sex and violence and betrayal and rebellion just tend to draw crowds better than tragedies about old men descending into madness. And this character, this pirate character, was probably more famous in London at the time than the fictional King Lear was in his own lifetime. He was discussed in the highest halls of power, and he was often called by the lords of England an arch-pirate. Some historians have gone on to call him the greatest pirate of the era, but I question that. It brings me back to that question of what defines the greatest pirate of an age. This pirate might qualify under certain parameters, but I think he comes in at second or third place even. That shouldn't detract from his story. He was an arch-pirate, and to the English, he was the most famous of the Mediterranean pirates. What made his story, and the story of his contemporaries, so fascinating is the world in which they operated. See, piracy was a known fact of life for every mariner in the Mediterranean. Muslim Barbary pirates had been active there for more than a century. The Barbarossas, Dragut, Sinan Rais, and Murat Rais. These were known threats, and the threat of Barbary piracy waxed and waned all throughout the 1500s. But there was a very significant difference here between the Barbary corsairs and these pirates in question. These pirates were European Christians. Violence between the Muslim world and the Christian world was kind of expected, but these men, Dutch and French and English, well, they joined forces with the Barbary corsairs. They betrayed their homeland and their countrymen, and eventually they betrayed God himself, at least of the eyes of the people living back in Europe. And there were pirates operating in and around Europe. Let's not pretend there weren't. Well, more than pirates, there were privateers in Europe that were busy attacking other Europeans, but this was mostly during wartime, and we will need to talk about those wars, but not today. There has been a lot of talk of politics and religion and war on the show lately, and I'm really eager to get to some good old-fashioned piracy. The big difference here is that the privateers up in Europe were fighting a patriotic fight. They were fighting for God and Queen, or, for representative council, and for their country. But the European pirates, well, they were either ignoring those allegiances or they were actively fighting against them. So, I'd like you to try for a moment to erase all of the preconceived ideas you have about piracy and pirate raids and pirates themselves. I'd like you to try and put yourself into the shoes of a Venetian merchant sailor in 1603. Your idea of a pirate as this Venetian merchant sailor in 1603, in fact, what the definition of a pirate was a turban-wearing, olive-skinned Muslim corsair. He sailed on a galley propelled by oars, and he had a scimitar at his waist. His shouts were in praise of Allah, and you knew that the fate of any Christian taken on one of their raids was slavery. So you are that merchant captain with a 160-ton, 4-gun, 2-masted, square-rigged carrack. That ship wasn't as large or as well-armed as those galleons being built in Spain, but it was fast, and without the need for oars, it had ample holds. The guns that were on board were welcome, even if the Turks weren't as active on the sea as they had been a few years ago. There was always the danger of Moorish pirates. But they weren't your concern here today. They were just another danger on the sea that every sailor had to be aware of: pirates and sharks and storms. They could be avoided, and if not, they could be dealt with. But pirates aside, you're having a fine day. You're on your way from Venice with a hold full of precious goods bound for Rome itself, though you'll be stopping in Naples and Sicily. The sea was clear and calm, and the waters were a shimmering blue. The sky was clear save for a bright yellow sun. So what would you think, a Venetian merchant captain in 1603 on such a fine day, when you saw Dutch sails on the horizon? That might seem a bit strange. Why would the Dutch be down here in the Mediterranean in the first place? But Venice, your homeland, wasn't at war with the Dutch. They were fighting against the Spanish king on the continent, but that conflict hadn't really reached the Mediterranean. I imagine you'd take a closer look, and upon closer inspection you might see that the ship was, a sleek vessel. She rode low in the water, only 2 decks, and perhaps space for 10 or 12 guns, and she had 3 masts with a fully rigged bowsprit. And she could really move. She ate through the waves close to the coast like nothing you'd ever seen, at least nothing without oars to propel her. This ship looked impressive. It had to be something new. You weren't familiar with anything built like this. It was long and low and nimble, and it was well armed for such a small ship. Everything about her screamed Coast Guard. And when she finally got in close enough, your crew would probably gather around to have a look. And you would see that this sleek new vessel was flying the Spanish flag. Now that was a good sign. But still, regardless, it's best to tell the men to be ready if there happened to be any trouble afoot. Maybe these Spaniards were friends, but even if they were, they could be out here hunting pirates after all. An hour or so later, that ship would hail you. She would pull up alongside your vessel, and the captain would introduce himself and his crew, or at least he would try to. See, as a Venetian, you probably didn't speak Dutch, and most Dutchmen probably didn't speak the Venetian dialect. They might speak a bit of Corsican or Tuscan, but unlikely to speak Venetian. However, both of you would be likely to speak Spanish. You would find out, speaking Spanish, that they are in fact merchants out of Dunkirk. Dunkirk was Spanish-held territory in the war, and it was giving the Dutch real problems in their little revolution. His crew were mostly Dutch, but some of them were English, as it turned out. That might be a bit worrisome. Englishmen and Dutchmen were known heretics, but all of the men on board this vessel claimed to be good Catholics, and the Englishmen among them spit whenever the Protestant witch they had for a queen was named. The Dutch would speak sadly of the troubles in their homeland, and said that they prayed that King Philip would soon have it all sorted out. Some of them claimed to be what were called Dunkirkers, or former Dunkirkers. Those were privateers in the employ of Spain. But the war was getting a bit too dangerous to be profitable, so these Dunkirkers retired and took on a merchant expedition in the employ of Spain. Men like those were just the sort of sailors that you might want to keep close in case there was any trouble. So naturally you would introduce yourself, and then you'd go on to share pleasantries with the crew. All around, you might find them to be a good group of boys. Being merchant ships meeting on the sea, you would probably discuss the best places to sell wares, and you, being native to the region, would know the best places to buy the goods that will fetch a particularly good price back in the Netherlands. Finally, though, you would have to ask them about their ship. What was it? At that moment, you see the captain get a light in his eyes. He might stroke the rail of his vessel. I like to think that you may have seen men treat their lovers with that sort of affection, but not their wives. The captain tells you that this ship is something new. They build them there in Dunkirk. They have a shallow draft so that they can traverse the seas on the coast of the Netherlands. They're calling them frigate-built. He bought this one as his privateer vessel, and it worked well hunting the Zee rovers out of Holland. It was quite an impressive vessel. Now, you might consider asking the captain here to tag along with you. You really could introduce him to all of the right people all around Italy that could fetch him a wonderful price for all of his goods. And in doing so, you could help the Spanish in their war effort, which was all to the good, and you could claim a little commission for your aid. Plus, if you did run into any trouble, that frigate-built ship would be a real help, and perhaps, who knows, the captain might just be willing to share some of her secrets. Venice would really be able to use a fleet of them there in the Adriatic. But then a shout in, is it Dutch or English? It came from the Dutchman, and it was full of terror. You turn, and then you see it. To the starboard there was a galley filled with a horde of dusky bearded men wearing turbans and wielding scimitars. Somehow, you don't know how, but somehow they crept up on you without anyone noticing. Mohammedan corsairs. You see a hail of arrows set loose from the galley, followed by shouts in their barbaric tongue. And then the arrows fall. Some of your men are hit, but it's not too bad. But then you see that these Mohammedans are climbing the hull toward your rail and your deck. You call your men to arms. A few of them rush the rail immediately to cut the grapples and the lines with their axes. Some of them have guns to fire down on the first pirates. Meanwhile, the quartermaster grabs all of the guns and the sabers, and he gets them out to the men who rush the rail to fight that first wave of the Moors. The Dunkirkers! You call back for aid, and you see them scrambling to get their weapons. You order a plank set across the gap for them to cross. A few of the younger, braver Dunkirkers swing over on a line with their blades already drawn. Their gunners man the swivel guns and take up arquebuses. They're lighting wicks and packing powder. And suddenly you believe them about their experience fighting in the war. These are clearly fighting men. So, now that you have allies in your back, you turn around to face the incoming corsairs. You see a few of them getting over the railing. Some of the Englishmen that swung over are already in the rigging with guns drawn, ready to fire. Then you hear a command bellowed in a language you don't understand, and a volley from behind. And then you see several of your men fall over the rail, into the water, or into the deck of the corsair galley. Why did the Dutchmen fire? They only hit your men. You turn around, and then you see one of the Englishmen from the frigate, one of the men who spat when his queen was named, approaching you with his saber drawn and 2 men with guns to either side. Smoke and the smell of powder and blood fills the air, and another volley lets fly. This time you see it. This was aimed at your men. The Englishman sneers and he gestures for you to lower your sword. This is a disaster, and you are forced to call for a surrender. When the smoke finally clears, you find that your crew is either wounded or taken prisoner. 3 of them are dead, and several more will be by morning. And you have to have another discussion with the captain. Not the Dutchman who you'd met earlier, the real captain, that Englishman. This Englishman, it turns out, doesn't speak Spanish. He speaks in a language that is almost Italian. You catch bits of Venetian and a bit of Tuscan, and it's clear that he expects you to understand. But you hear some German and some English in there, and then, is that the language of the Turk? What is he speaking? It doesn't make any sense. He's clearly frustrated, so he brings over the Dutchman from earlier to translate in Spanish. He informs you that he is here as a privateer, but he has no design on your ship. What he's after here is provisions. They need guns and shot and food and water. They are engaged in a war, after all, you understand, and it's taken a toll on them. You might argue that the war was with Spain, and yes, it is, but Venice is a known ally of Spain. This isn't personal, this is necessity. The English captain begins to look almost apologetic. He pulls out a letter of reprisal and shows it to you, and it looks on the up and up. They will only take what they need, though. He promises to spare your lives, to give you your ship and most of your cargo intact, so long as you give over what they need. You might scoff at that if you had the courage. If he was a privateer, after all, he should explain the presence of those Turks. But then the captain does. See, he and his men, his English and Dutch friends, were abandoned in Morocco by their captain and their companions. They had to take on whatever crew and ship they could, and they couldn't find much. They were forced to sail for Algiers in a leaky little old galley that barely made the trip. There they picked up some crew. There weren't any Europeans, though. The Pasha, the governor there, forced them to take on these Mohammedan corsairs and a whole corps of janissaries. He said that was the law. They could choose either that, or they could lose their ship and their freedom. The captain then glances over his shoulder and lowers his voice. See, these Turks are vile pirates. They have no respect for anyone or anything, certainly no Europeans. We didn't even want to attack your ship, you understand, but they forced our hand, and they will absolutely take everything of value that they're able to find, and they will find everything. The captain said he has no wish to impoverish one of his fellow Christians. He just needs enough to survive until he can shake these Turks. So the privateer tells you that if you have any chests of coin hidden away, or maybe a stash of valuables, it would be in your best interest if you handed them over to him. He could look after them, he could guard them, and on his honor as a righteous Christian man, he would return them. He would even, he said, give over a little bit from his own purse as recompense for the damage done here today. Now, what choice do you have here? There were no good options in this situation. Whether he were telling the truth or lying, most people would hand over their valuables. Naturally, you agree to do so. You tell him where your stash and the stash of your top officers is hidden so that he can secure it away. The Englishmen and Dutchmen are busy unloading the cannons and shot and powder and food and water. You do notice that they're leaving you enough food and water to make it safely to a harbor. But you do see that the Turks among them are exploring your holds, and you start seeing them carrying up things that are not what the captain had promised. When finally they appear to be done, they all get on board their privateer vessel, that frigate that you had so admired, and the captain waves a goodbye to you and fires off a shot in salute, and you notice that he still has all of those private valuables on board, never to be seen again. So what would you do in that situation? You had enough food and water to get home, you still had your ship, but how would you respond? You might sue for redress in England. Your goods were bound for Rome, not Spain, so they were not a valid target for privateers. This was the most common action taken by Italian merchants, and this happened to a lot of Italian merchants, and there are a few reasons that I wanted to share this fictitious story with you. I wanted to put you in the shoes of a merchant experiencing an attack like this. This was, well, piracy in the Mediterranean was nothing new. They knew of the Barbary corsairs and their depredations, and of course most Europeans were familiar with privateering raids by other Europeans, but this was different. This was a pirate raid that most Europeans hadn't ever seen before. The ships, this frigate, which is kind of a big deal in this era, was something new, but also the tactics used, this pretending to be friendly, which happened very often, a false flag attack. And considering how new this is where the piracy that we have come to know and love begins. So I wanted to put you there. And beyond that, we skip over a lot of the less noteworthy raids that occur during our story here on the Pirate History Podcast. Mostly because during the buccaneering era and even the golden age of piracy, most mariners knew that it was just better in most cases to strike sail and surrender. You wouldn't have as many of your goods stolen, and not one of your men would be injured or killed. However, here in the early 1600s, they didn't know that. These merchants knew traditionally that they had to fight for their lives against pirates, against the Barbary corsairs, or they would be taken into slavery. So when faced with piracy done by Christian Europeans, they thought they had to fight as well. But there were dozens, even perhaps hundreds, of this sort of complaint made to the English government. See, England had a long history of privateering. They were well acquainted with these sort of complaints. Ever since King Henry VIII declared that privateers, quote, shall enjoy to his proper use, profit, and commodity all such ships, vessels, munition, merchandise, wares, victuals, and goods, which they shall take of any of his Majesty's said enemies. End quote. And then, ever since Queen Elizabeth's declaration that all such complaints be heard in the Admiralty Court, a court which received 10% of all profits from any privateers, the English had grown quite adept at dealing with and ignoring these complaints. The captain in question would likely receive the same reception from the Dutch officials, who had much the same system. Would you take your complaints to the Ottomans if you were that Venetian sea captain? There were Moorish pirates among them, clearly from Barbary, but it was a Dutch ship, and there was an English captain, and the letter of marque was not from the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans were at peace with Venice, and what's more, those Barbary pirates were in a state of rebellion. They were no longer under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. More on that later. But regardless of whomever you petitioned for redress, whichever authorities heard the name of that particular privateer captain in question, their reaction would invariably be the same. Their eyes would go cold. They would take down a report, but they would tell you that no redress was to follow. They would then inform you that this particular Englishman was no longer a subject of Her Majesty. He had abandoned his country like a thief in the night, and that was what he quite literally was. Not only that, he had abandoned his faith and his church. He had gone beyond that. He had abandoned his God and his Messiah. He had left Christ behind, and now worshipped Allah and the Prophet Muhammad. He was living in Tunis, reportedly, and that was a rogue city, so the English ambassador to the Ottoman Empire couldn't get the Sultan to do anything. So you were just out of luck. This was something different. This was real piracy. So you would very politely be told that you would be receiving no money from the Admiralty, but you could rest assured in one thing: everyone in the world was currently hunting that particular pirate. Now, that attack didn't happen. It was fictitious, but I did take elements from many first-hand accounts of several different pirate raids that would take place between about 1595 and 1625, and we're lucky that there are several such accounts we can draw from. Unfortunately, there are few records left by the pirates here. We have very little from their point of view. Now, we have a great deal from one particular pirate, but he's hardly representative, and he comes a little bit later. However, I would like to introduce the first of our European Mediterranean Barbary pirates. He was that most famous of English pirates, that arch-pirate from earlier. His name was John Ward, though he commonly went by Jack. An Englishman, an English agent named Henry Pepwell, was sent to Tunis to investigate John Ward in 1607. He reported to the English ambassador in Venice, quote, John Ward, commonly called Captain Ward, is about 55 years of age, very short with little hair, and that quite white, bald in front, swarthy face and beard, speaks little and almost always swearing, drunk from morn till night, most prodigal and plucky, sleeps a great deal. End quote. Now, earlier I know that I said that I didn't have a favorite pirate, but from that description alone I kind of love John Ward already. He's what I aspire to be as an older man. That description of him is our best physical description of John Ward, at least from a reliable source. Now, there are some other sources, some more reliable and some less, but they're what we have to go on. The first of these was a pamphlet entitled News from the Sea of Two Notorious Pirates, printed in 1609, based largely around the report made by Henry Pepwell. It was an immediate hit in the London bookshops, and despite some verifiably false information, it does give us what we know about John Ward's birth and childhood. It tells us, quote, "This Ward, as base in birth as bad in condition, in the last year of her late Majesty's reign, gave the first onset to his wicked intendiments. His parentage was mean, his estate low. His profession was a fisherman of Faversham in Kent, though he would be confined to no limits, nor anything could serve him but the wide ocean. In this wicked resolution he set forth from Faversham in a small ketch towards Plymouth." End quote. This is telling us that in the year 1603, the last year of her late Majesty's reign, John Ward decided to turn pirate, and that's mostly true. But he didn't do so out of the blue in a small fishing ketch out of Faversham. If that English agent were correct, then Ward was 55 when this report was written. That would mean that he was born in either 1553 or 1554, and that would make him 35 years old and in possession of at least one ship capable of sea travel in the year 1588. Now, Faversham was on the coast, and it was only 48 miles from London. It's almost certain that agents of Queen Elizabeth arrived in Faversham shortly after Philip II of Spain blessed the banner of the Spanish Armada. Now, we don't know whether or not John Ward was still a fisherman at 35 in 1588, but if he was, it was here that he answered the call to enter the Channel and potentially to do battle with Spain. John Ward fought against the Spanish Armada in 1588 during the attempted invasion, under, notably, Admiral Sir Francis Drake. Now, we can banish any images of dashing heroics here. He almost certainly wasn't there when the proper initial battle was fought. He was a privateer, he wasn't a navyman, and though Drake was technically his admiral, John Ward never received any orders from Drake and certainly never met the man. His job, along with many others, was probably to defend London when the Spanish passed by. There were many ship captains that had the perhaps enviable job of sitting around with what were, in truth, really just terrible guns on their decks. Just many of those guns didn't even work, but they tried to look intimidating. One ketch out of Faversham, owned by a fisherman with a few antique firearms on board, wasn't going to scare anybody away. But if you get a few dozen of them, backed up by a few staunch warships, well, that just might convince the Spanish Armada to move on. So, Ward, well, he may have fought here, but he was at least prepared to fight in defense of Queen and country. This was that patriotic motivation we discussed earlier. I mean, he probably earned some money here, but he was willing to put his life on the line to answer the call in England's time of need. That's a patriotic move. In this moment, you could compare him favorably to the English ship owners who offered up their yachts for Operation Dynamo in 1940. Now, next time, we're going to be looking at John Ward, among several others, in that Anglo-Spanish War that was part of the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands. But John Ward served in that conflict, and that's what's important today. He was a privateer. Nearly all of the sailors in what passed for a navy in Elizabethan England were in fact privateers. That was Elizabeth's policy. The crown was poor and couldn't afford a navy. Privateers, though, were cheap, and they might actually bring funds in. But that war was going to end. Queen Elizabeth would die in 1604, and James, the King of Scotland, would become James I of England when he took up the throne. And under James, all of those privateering commissions dried up. There was a privateer named Richard Bishop who had a commission under Elizabeth and lost it. He wrote that James I, quote, hath lessened by this general peace the flourishing employment that we seafaring men do bleed for at sea, end quote. Now, If John Ward were, in fact, the sort of man for which nothing would serve but the wide ocean, can you imagine him going from a profitable privateering career in the North Sea back to fishing off of the coast of a tiny hamlet in Kent? I can't, and John Ward couldn't either. So he signed up to be a sailor in the Royal Navy on board a ship called the Lion's Whelp. It was a small Coast Guard ship, but he was never happy there. To be fair, no one was happy in the Royal Navy. It was a thankless way of life that usually gave out poor rations and worse pay, not to mention all of the punishments dealt to anyone that grumbled too loudly. But again, we don't have any of Ward's own thoughts written down during this time. John Ward almost certainly couldn't read or write. But all accounts that we do have call him quiet. Terse, maybe, is a better word, laconic, and when he did speak, he was a man prone to swearing. But remember that play I mentioned earlier that outsold King Lear and lasted longer at the theater than King Lear? That was written by a man named Andrew Barker, and it was entitled A True and Certain Report of the Beginning, Proceedings, Overthrows, and Now Present Estate of Captain Ward. From now on, if I need to refer to it, I'll probably just call it A True and Certain Report of Captain Ward. But Andrew Barker was quite happy to fill in some of those gaps left by Ward, and he did so with almost elegant prose. But he gives the best description we have of Ward during his years in the Navy, whether or not they are actually true. Barker tells us that when he was in the Navy, Ward would, quote, sit melancholy, curse the time, repine at other men's good fortunes, and complain of the hard crosses that attended his own. End quote. There are some official accounts of Ward's tendency towards drink and violence and the cheapest women money could buy. He was something of a troublesome sailor, but they still wanted him on board. But we don't know what it was that pushed him to become a pirate. Did he receive a lashing? Maybe a demotion or a cut in pay. Maybe it was the rats on the ship or weevils in the bread. We don't know. But, once again, Andrew Barker is willing to put words into his mouth here. He writes, fictitiously, of Ward saying, quote, here's a scurvy world, and as scurvily we live in it. Where are the days that have been, and the season that we have seen, when we might sing, swear, drink, drab, and when he says drab here, he means to cavort with prostitutes, to sing, swear, drink, drab, and kill men as freely as your cake makers do flies, where we might do what we list, and the law would bear us out in it, nay, when we might lawfully do that which we shall be hanged for, when the whole sea was our empire, where we rob at will. End quote. That is quite a speech, and John Ward never said that. But I enjoy the sentiment. It creates a character of John Ward. And it may actually have been a decent representation of what John Ward felt. The author did talk to many former privateers that some of them turned pirate to amalgamate this response. But in the play, John Ward gave that little speech to a group of about 30 other sailors that were serving on the Lion's Whelp. They weren't on board, though. They were in a tavern in Portsmouth. See, earlier that day, John Ward had heard from one of the women with which he kept company that there was a wealthy Catholic Englishman there in Portsmouth that had decided to take his family and set sail for the friendlier shores of France. Now, he wasn't only taking his family, he was taking all of their worldly possessions and a substantial amount of hard coin. Now, the family and his household staff were asleep in an inn nearby, but all of his goods were already on board a ship at anchor in Portsmouth Harbor. So, after a few rounds, and Ward was kind enough to buy these rounds for these 30 or so men, he gave that speech, and that inflamed the men. It reminded them of what they used to be. And then he informed them of that traitorous Catholic who was leaving English shores to flee to France. And there was a good bit of religious prejudice here. Remember, James I was considered by many English people to be a little too friendly with the Catholics. They would go on to have a civil war over the Stuart dynasty and their ties to Catholicism. But in James I's England, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, and the audience here, listening to this play, would be expected to sympathize with Ward. You know, he's only robbing some fat, rich, opulent Catholic, which would have played well to many London audiences. Certainly a lot better than King Lear, which was trying to paint a sympathetic picture of a king, which were not particularly popular in England. But in the play, Ward convinces his men, those 30 or so men that had bellies full of wine and ale, that they should make for the harbor. He convinced them that this was the right move. So they made their way out of the tavern and through the streets of Portsmouth at night as quietly as possible. They made their way to the harbor, past any eyes that might have seen them, and Ward pointed out the ship that belonged to that Catholic men. The 30 of them climbed on board, making less sound than a single rat. There were a few sailors on board, of course, but they were subdued silently, and those 30 sailors prepared this ship for sail. They got her underway and maneuvered her out of Portsmouth harbor without a single call being raised or a gun being fired. It appeared that they had gotten away clean and nobody had seen them. When dawn came and the pleasant buzz of a night's drinking was beginning to fade into vicious headaches, the men decided it was a good time to go below decks and count their loot. And when they got there, they found that the holds were all empty. Somehow the Catholic had caught wind that a robbery was imminent, and he had had all of his cargo unloaded. Now, remember, this is a play. If any of it has its basis in truth, I would be surprised. But I would be downright incredulous if somebody told me that this little bit of drama had any truth to it, that the Catholic man had somehow heard that Ward and his men were preparing. I mean, that just didn't happen. You see, a bunch of drunk sailors might actually believe that some rich Catholic fop would be stupid enough to keep thousands of pounds sterling on an unguarded ship, and the author expects the audience to go along with that premise, but I'm not buying it. Now, one way or another, whether or not what happened in this play is true, Ward did find himself off the coast of western England in a small ship with no guns and 30 men from the Lion's Whelp. And that's actually true. The Lion's Whelp recorded these men jumping ship, and we also know where he was because it was corroborated by a French captain of a merchant ship when he told the Admiralty all about it. Off the southwestern coast of England, Ward and his men spotted that French merchantman, and Ward took this opportunity to give another eloquent speech, according to Andrew Barker, quote, "We have proceeded so far into the thieves' path that to return back we shall be stopped with a halter." End quote. And, when he says halter, he means a noose around the neck. Now, that speech, again, almost certainly didn't happen. But the men were portrayed in that play as ready to turn back. They had made a terrible mistake, and they all wanted to return to England and give the ship back and hopefully get back on board the Lion's Whelp. But that speech turned their spirits around. It turned them toward piracy. In reality, those men who had stolen a ship and sailed her across the southern coast of England probably saw that French merchantman and immediately jumped into action with only the briefest consultation. Something like, "Hey, a ship, do we rob it?" "Yes," and then they got to work. The men made sure that the English flag on board their vessel was flying high. 12 of the least suspicious sailors among them ran fingers through their hair and straightened their uniforms. And remember, they had gotten off the ship probably wearing some form of uniform or identification, and sailed away with those on. But the other 18 went below deck to prepare their weapons and to wait as silently as possible. And a scene that resembles a part of that hypothetical story I told earlier unfolded. Ward hailed the French merchantman there at sea. He came up alongside her and greeted the French captain as sailors in His Majesty's Royal Navy, and then they proceeded to enter into several hours of pleasantries. They all made clear that they were on friendly terms and nobody was a privateer. They discussed the weather and their ships and what the hated Spanish might be up to. This was typical talk when sailors met in the Channel. And they shared wine. They had found a good bit of fairly decent wine on board the ship that they had stolen, and they shared it with the Frenchmen. So when the crew of the merchantman was getting a little drunk and a little bit sleepy, and as the sun was setting and in their eyes, Ward gave a signal. 3 times on the deck with his boot heel. That was when a crew of armed, hungover pirates burst out, screaming, onto the deck of the French merchantman. Now, a lot has been made of these men being novice pirates, and they were. This was their first official act of piracy on the high seas. But they were veteran privateers, and let's not forget they were sailors with the Royal Navy. They knew what they were doing here, and they managed to take the French vessel without killing a single man. That was to the good. Ward ordered the French captives put aboard the smaller ship, the one he had stolen from Portsmouth, and he was going to take the merchantman with 6 guns and ample stores of powder and shot. This was a good ship for oceanic travel and for the business of piracy. However, a ship like that was a little bit too large for 30 men to crew. They could do it, but it was going to be hard work. So they would have to take on more crew, and as it happened, John Ward knew just where to find them. He piloted his ship for a fishing village nearby called Cawsand, which was a well-known haven for smugglers, known to John Ward from his privateering days. In the book Pirates of Barbary, Adrian Tinniswood writes what serves as the perfect cliffhanger to end today's episode. He writes, quote, "Throughout Ward's career as a pirate, one of his most effective qualities was his power of persuasion. He had convinced 30 men of the Lion's Whelp's crew to jump ship and steal the bark with its presumed cargo of Catholic gold. When that failed, he convinced them to take part in a daring act of piracy. In the years to come, he would convince Ottoman officials to provide him with men and munitions. He would convince English agents who came to hunt him down that they should change sides. And now, on the beach and on the quay and in the alehouse, he convinced the smugglers of Cawsand Bay to follow him to the Barbary coast." We're going to get to that story, but not next time. Next time, we're going to talk about the 2 other primary players in this first decade of European Barbary piracy. This time, one of them will be a Dutch sea rover who fought during the 80 Years' War against Spain, and a Frenchman who decided to turn pirate because of an argument with his mother-in-law.